Shalom. First and foremost, before I get started, I'd like to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Bahashim, Racha HaKodash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone who taught me the truth and rule well. Peace and blessings unto the hopeful elect, pushing his word throughout the four corners of the earth in truth, righteousness, and sincerity. To you I say Shalom. This is the brother Yeshaya coming at you again through the spirit and power of Yahweh Bahashim Yahweh Shai. Back with another video. Not sure what I'm gonna title this one because it just came up to me through the spirit. I just decided to go ahead and go live, but something along the lines with Esau, being the so-called white man, because this is one thing I heard the apostles talk about, and I figured I'd do a video on it. How the so-called white man, or the term white people, right, or Caucasian, is really, all those are modern terms. Back in the ancient world, there was no such thing as a white person or a white man or a Caucasian, right? Back then there was they had their own identity that was actually given to them from ancient times, right? But and we know the so-called white man to be Esau, Esau Edom, a descendant of a man called Esau, right, the brother of Jacob. But in a general sense, because we know everybody's mixed, everybody's mixed around, you have some Jakes that look like so-called white people. You even had some Edomites that look like so-called black people or so-called Hispanic people. So it's all ultimately through that bloodline, but also you can't really tell right now, only through the spirit, right? There's a scripture that says, the spirit bear witness with our spirit. Let me get that real quick. I think it's the book of Romans. Yeah, Romans 8:16. It says, the spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of the Most High. So this is a spiritual thing, right? Just because you look white doesn't mean that, you're Edomite. Or just because you look so-called, Chinese doesn't mean that, you're a Moabite. You see? So this is all, through the spirit. So if this truth resonates with you, there's a high chance that you could be an Israelite. Now we don't know who the elect are, but we know they're going to stem out of the house of Israel only, right? But anyway, let's jump back because I want to make this point. I looked this up in the AI overview, right? The Google AI overview. Term white people first, or term when was the term white people first used, right? And it says the concept of white people is a distinct racial group was specific with specific connotations. Salakia. It says particularly regarding privilege and superiority is a modern colonial invention. See, so it's a modern colonial invention. In the colonial times, that's whenever this thing was actually uh, uh, established, or was first beginning to be used, right? But it says the first known recorded use of the term white people in a printed European text was in Thomas Middleton's play, The Triumphs of Truth. It performed in 1613. Right, so in 1613, that's whenever that term white people was first used, right? And it says in the play, but it says in the play, an African king character uses the phrase to describe the English audience, indicating a novel or surprising distinction at the time. So it says before the mid 1600s, the English primarily identified themselves by nationality, religion, or other cultural practices, not solely by skin color. See, so that skin color, or um, uh, I guess, yeah, that's pretty much what you call it, right? Colorism, right? All that started, that was just recent. That was just a recent, these are just recent terms, a recent construct, right? But it says the concept of white as a racial identity emerged and gained prominence during the 17th century, right? So during the 1600s. It says within the context of colonialism and the development of racialized slavery. right? Because they would, because you gotta understand the term white. It coincides with purity, innocence, right, righteousness, right. But whenever they termed us, especially the Southern Kingdom, whenever they termed them black, that black coincides with darkness, coincides with uh, uh, evil, right? Pretty much a bunch of negative connotations, you know, coincides with black. So that was just a way, for Esau to portray himself as that angel of light, as the scripture says. Let me get that real quick. Right here, 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 14. It says, and no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. You see, and that's what Esau pushed in these times that he started coming up into power. That he was innocent, that they are the people, right? They are the true believers of the Christ, right? But it says, continuing on, what was that? Okay, it says in colonial settings, particularly in places like Barbados, labor codes began to use the term white to distinguish European ident- indentured servants from enslaved Africans. hmm It says this distinction was used to grant Europeans greater rights and privileges, right? So white supremacy, right? Um, but it says thereby reinforcing a social hierarchy based on race and serving to prevent solidarity between enslaved and indentured laborers, right? So privileged, white privilege, right? But it says, well, that's pretty much it on that. The point is made. This is just a modern term, right? Even the term Caucasian, because actually there was something that I missed here, because I know in 1681. Hold on. In 1681, they ended up putting it into colonial law. Let me see if it pops up. Right, so it says in the context of colonial laws, and specifically the year 1681, the term white people played a significant role in shaping the legal and social structure of colonial America, particularly in Maryland. Right, and from there that spread, right? As we read, to put a difference between um pretty much making everything, because you know how Esau is, he likes to categorize everything. So he separated, different races by color, which is why colorism, started to become heavy, especially during slave times and leading up to now, right? Because even Jake, suffers from colorism. They won't accept, you know, uh, there's some Jake, especially in the truth, that won't accept white people or so-called white people, right, as being one of the tribes of Israel. Because I mean, not all white people, of course, there ain't, but I'm saying like there might be a Jake that looks so-called white, but he's a Jake, like the Irish or the Italians, right? And they'll paint them as just being white. But nah, like I just read earlier in the beginning, Romans 8 and 16, it's all through the spirit, right? But anyway, so yeah, this 1681, that's whenever it started to, come up into the legal system, which, leads up to where we're at now. Everybody views things in the color aspect, black, white, brown, right? Let me see. Let's get this other one. Caucasian, because these so-called white people, they ain't Caucasians either, right? It says the term Caucasian was first used by in a scientific context by German anthropologist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. In the late 18th century, specifically in 1795, he used it to classify humans into different races, with the Caucasian race being based on a skull from Georgia in the Caucasus region, right? So the Caucasus Mountains. You can just look up, as a matter of fact, I can do it here in a minute, but it says, finishing this out, it says, which he considered to be the most beautiful. Of course he would, because he's a Caucasian, so of course he'll say that shit. But let me look this. Georgia, Caucasus Mountain Caves. See, they have cave systems where they used to live at. See, you can see it right here. See? So probably he got the skull from one of these places where civilizations of Edomites used to live at. Because they were pushed into the caves during the Dark Ages, right? They were considered a vile people, right? See? So there you go. But again, just going back to the point, the term white people or Caucasians, those are all modern terms to classify the so-called white race, the Edomites, right? But we all know they all go back to a man called Esau, and I got it right here. This is Genesis 36 and verse 9. It says, "And these are the generations of Esau, the father of the Edomites in Mount Seir." Right, because when you go into, we'll get it here in a minute. Let me see. Genesis 25, and I'll start at 25. As a matter of fact, I'll start at uh I'll start at 21. Genesis 25 and 21. It says, "And Isaac entreated the Lord his wife, or for his wife, because she was barren, and the Lord Yahweh was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord Yahweh. And the Lord said unto her, Two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels." Right? Those two manner of people, of course, talking about the Israelites and the Edomites, right? But it says, two manner of people are in thy bowels, or two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Right? So pretty much fraternal twins, right? As we're gonna read. The first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. So he came out red, right? Because back then they dyed garments. They would get the the skin of whatever animal, mainly I guess lamb or goat, and they'll dye it, dip it in red, right? And that's how they'll dye their garments. And but his name, Esau, pretty much refers to those red hairy garments. But what when you read this, what is this describing? Like who else comes out red when they're born? So-called white people, right? But it says, "And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob." Right? So it didn't even describe Jacob coming out, how he looked or whatever. Why? Because everybody back then was of color. Everybody had melanin. Back in the ancient times, there was no such thing as a white person. The first so-called white person, you could say, was Cain, right, and his descendants, but they all died from the flood, right? And then he came back again through the process of regeneration. Cain came back in, in the body of Esau. That same spirit came back and was called Esau, right? And now you see the children of Esau, they're, and you can see how they look, right? Red, right? Because they ain't white. You know, whenever they're in the sun, they get exposed to the sun too long, they'll start turning red. Or whenever they get angry, they get red. Pretty much the melanin was stripped from them. And you see that whenever Jake gets leprosy, you know, Jake, dark-skinned Jake, that ends up getting leprosy, they end up turning white. Pretty much their pigment starts to get, pretty much, it goes away, right? And the skin color looks so-called white. But it's really their skin that's being wasted away. Like Esau is pretty much a clean leper. That's all he is, right? But it says, I'm going to read this again. Genesis 25 and 25, it says, and the first came out red all over like a hairy garment. So this is the birth of the so-called white race, right? The progenitor of the white race. It says, and the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. Verse 26, and after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. So verse 27, it says, and the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter and a man of the field. Hey, and that same spirit is upon these Edomites right now. You know, who are the ones out there in the woods hunting, you know what I'm saying, you know, using guns or bows and arrows, right? Who's the one that likes doing that shit? Out there camping in the woods, being a man of the field, right? It's mainly these Edomites. They have a whole industry, you know, based off them, you know, trying to, whatever, game hunting and all that shit, right? As a matter of fact, you see all these Edomites, especially over here, you know, where we're at, over here in North Carolina, a lot of these Edomites, they be wearing camouflage all the time. You know, they're always talking about hunting and shit. But anyway, it says, and Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. So let me skip down. As a matter of fact, I'll just continue reading from here. Verse 28, and Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob sod pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom, right? So Edom just meaning red. That's when his name was changed, or then his descendants were called Edomites, right? But it says, verse 31, it says, and Jacob said, sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me? So this is going into the beginning of pretty much Esau starting to hate his brother. Well, actually, this is whenever he sells his birthright. Later on, whenever Jacob supplants his father to give him the blessing, that's whenever Esau, you know, develops that hatred. But yeah, that was pretty much the point. You know what I'm saying? I didn't want to make this too long. You know, this is the origin of the so-called Edomites. You know, like I said, the term white people, this is just modern. This is a modern concept, a social construct that was developed. You know, and Esau's been hiding under different names for years. You know, he doesn't want to, especially the top elite. You know, they don't want that stain of that name, Edomite or Esau or whatever, to come out into the world. You know, but it's already out. You know, the scriptures talk about. Let me get this real quick. see. I'll start at 7. 2 Thessalonians 2 and 7. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way. Right. So the mystery of iniquity. Because for a while, it wasn't known who the wicked were. Right. But now it's known. Now it's known that it's these Edomites. They're the what they call, the scriptures talk about the children of Satan, right? Because they do the bidding of Satan. But verse 8 it says, and then shall the wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth. And how's that happening? How are the wicked being consumed with the spirit of the Lord's mouth? Through the prophets. The prophets out here exposing them, letting the world know who they are, right? Calling out on their evil plans and schemes and wickedness, right? It says, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming, right? Because the return of our Lord is ultimately going to be the finale of Esau's kingdom, right? He's going to destroy and dismantle this system that he has created, this whole, I guess, sort of matrix that he has us living in, right? But yeah, that was pretty much it. I pray this lesson was edifying. I'm going to go ahead and close it out by giving all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh Bahashem, Yahweh Shai Bahashem, Rachak Wadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone who taught me this truth and rule well. Peace and blessings unto the hopeful elect pushing his word throughout the four corners of the earth in truth, righteousness, and sincerity. Until the next time, I'm going to say Shalom. Kwam Masha Allah.